Welcome, investigator. Evil is on the rise. Crime is escalating. Our mission is to eliminate the crime by exposing evil, examine why it manifests, and highlight the brave souls that confront it every day. Join us as we work together to bring justice to every victim. Welcome to All Things Crime. Here's your host, Jared Bradley.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of All Things Crime. I'm Jared. I've got my man Tom Myers with me today. We are excited about some stuff that we've uncovered about a former guest and good friend of the show, and also an amazing story behind, tragic story, but also a big MBAC story as well. So we're going to intertwine all of that, but we're going to talk a little bit about the Chris Tapp case. And if you haven't heard, Chris Tapp actually passed away about a month or 6 weeks ago or something like that. And, so here we are toward the end of 2023 and Chris Tapp is gone. And what a tragedy that is, just in the fact that he's no longer with us, but also as we review his life and what all happened, I think this is one of those that I think should be a case study for lots of law enforcement agencies on basically what not to do. I mean, it's not just the law enforcement, but the entire justice system, and who knows what happened after he was actually released. So the bottom line is, if you don't know the Chris Tapp story, this is a young man that in I believe it was 96, right, Tom?
That's correct. Yep.
Yeah. Welcome to the show again, by the way.
Good to be here, Jared.
Yeah. I just started plowing into it, man. Forgot all about bringing you in. Anyway, Chris Tapp was one of those guys that was wrong place, wrong time, wrong everything. And the more we review his story and it's been done over and over and over, and the focus was on the tragedy. And I don't want to make this into like a big drama, and I definitely don't want to hammer on the investigators too much today. But at the same time, I think taking a somewhat objective view of what really happened and kind of how the police ended up focusing on him. But let's do a little background here just to bring everybody up in case you haven't heard of Chris Tapp. He was basically a 17, 18-year-old back in 1996, and there was a young girl named Angie Dodge. She was 3 weeks out of high school and lived in Idaho Falls, Idaho. Back in the 90s, Idaho Falls was just a beautiful little town, probably less than 50,000, somewhere 40,000, somewhere around there on the southeast corner of Idaho. Just an absolute amazing area, amazing people, super safe area that I'm sure most people didn't even lock their doors, let alone, their cars and things like that. We just, back in those days in Idaho, we just didn't worry about it. A lot of crime just wasn't in the cards. It was just a really safe area to live in. And so when Angie Dodge was murdered, it sent shockwaves through the entire community. And Angie was raped. She was stabbed multiple times, I think 16 times. And she was, her throat was slit. The perpetrator had actually used her teddy bear to muffle her screams. And, this was in a little apartment that she was in on a second floor. And she'd only been in there just a matter of days, and possibly, just a couple of weeks. So hadn't been in there very long when she was murdered, and it was horrible. And so, but as many of you know, as you're living in a small community, when something this horrific happens, especially to a young, innocent girl that is just starting out in her life, the demand for justice rings very loudly. And that is absolutely what happened with Angie's murder. And they went at it, and they narrowed down onto a few suspects, and Chris Tapp was one that they really focused on. And he was just a young kid, had no idea really that he was even a suspect initially. And by the time he was actually in court and being charged, he was in a bad way. And he ended up serving 20 years. He was convicted and ended up serving 20 years in prison for a crime that he didn't commit. And if you're not super familiar with this case, again, we actually interviewed him. Geez, man, it had to be two almost 3 years ago. So you could go back into the archives of the All Things Crime and find his episodes in there, and just what a remarkable man he was, because even after being held in prison for 20 years for a crime he didn't commit, he still had a pretty amazing attitude. And that's really what caught my eye about it. I mean, the fact that the MVAC helped him help get him out, at least, help him get the Alford plea. And then the police were able to focus on genealogical DNA and help him get out. But Tom, there were a lot of things that you said you have researched and looked at, especially once we found out that Chris had passed away. So what's your initial thoughts on this?
Yeah, I took this one on, Jared, because I knew you had a personal stake in this, having gone up to Idaho and bringing the MVAC up there for part of the exoneration on it. So I know this one's a personal thing for you. And I'm aware of the exoneration that took place, but I don't have that personal beef into it. So I wanted to look at this entire matter objectively without watching the videos or seeing the slants or the YouTubes against the police or anything else. And I wanted to understand how this thing happened. So maybe we can bring up some solutions in the future and explain to people. And it seems to be divided on political lines or belief lines. There's either a bad guy on one side, the police set him up, or there's a bad guy on the other side saying, well, he had to have done something on this. So how did that happen between those, that cross-transferal? And maybe I can shed some clarity on what I found and just looking through this, and maybe some insights or anything else. So with that, I'll bring us back to 1996 when Angie gets an apartment. She's 18 years of age, self-sufficient. Mom lives in the town still, like you said, about 50,000 up to maybe 150 or so now is what Idaho Falls has. Police department, pretty contemporaneous in as much as training and things like that. I'm not sure if they have a coroner or if they have an medical examiner system out in Idaho, but there are resources and there are training and all sorts of things at play when you have competing interests for the police time and what happens on this. Okay, so let's go back to 1996. We have this horrific rape homicide that takes place with the numerous stab wounds that happened to Angie Dodge in her apartment in Idaho Falls. And this happens in the summer of 96. No one is developed as a subject or a suspect until January of 97, when one of Chris Tapp's friends, Benjamin Hobbs, is arrested down in Ely, Nevada, about 400 miles away, for a similar type crime. Now, I have read a few documents here, most notably the comprehensive report by Judges for Justice, but also Idaho Innocence Project and a couple of treatises and missives on this. And so I'm very familiar with it. I'm trying to blind myself to the bias that's in here and the darts that are being thrown at the police. And I'm trying to say, okay, how did we get to this point? We do know at this, looking back on this, and what jumps out at everybody right away is that 7 police officers are being sued, I guess now by the estate of Chris, but at the time, that's what was happening with the Idaho Falls. But I'll also add that to the credit, if you want to call it that, Idaho Falls took charge and took ownership of this when they saw they had a problem, and they investigated it rather thoroughly. So, kudos there. They're trying to right a wrong, which is obviously what happened to Chris in this case, because he was exonerated. And when the actual offender, Brian Drips, comes forward, he states that he's the sole perpetrator in this offense. So how does this happen? He becomes the target or the subject of the investigation when an associate of Chris's is arrested for a very similar rape that takes place down in Ely, Nevada. To this day, you can still see internet references to Hobbs being a sexual predator. Nothing's currently in the system, but that's probably what happened in 96. So the amount of focus, a lot like the Kohlberger attack that happened over is off the scale in a small town with limited resources. And what happens is it just paralyzes the community at that time. So you're getting it from both. If you don't bring a subject forward, the amount of pressure is what I'm saying. If you don't bring a subject forward, you don't develop something on this, you're not taking aggressive police work on this, you're going to be called inept, Keystone Cops, lazy, stupid, all sorts of things is subject to it. But when you do take action on it, you have that magic time period, you're held under that same sort of spotlight, and you can make mistakes on this. And we can also Monday morning quarterback it because technology changes. In 96, we needed something about the size of a quarter for DNA that took place. So are there shortcomings in the criminal investigation of it that are brought forth? For example, not getting the temperature of the body on the scene? Yes, there are. In a perfect world, I don't know whether the coroner or the ME responded to the scene and what the delay was on something like that. But that is what erodes an investigation. And in a perfect world, you would have police officers that have to undergo a level of training akin to about a year long, and where they stay and they have the resources to work this. There's never a shortage of overtime or anything like that. So from all accounts, I think these guys worked this pretty hard. And when they tried to establish a rapport when they sat down with him on at least the 3 interviews, I'm going to call it that. So around January 7th, January 10th, and I believe shortly thereafter on a scheduled interview after Chris Tapp gets himself an attorney and he doesn't show up for the next interview, and that's when they get a warrant and they arrest him. I could have that incorrect. What happens is you're looking across. When somebody goes let me back up. In small town America, everybody is very compliant and agreeable. They want to solve this. When somebody's not, or somebody runs and gets an attorney, that's a tell. I don't care what you're entitled to, as you want to be cooperative and you want to solve that. And if you have a personality, what I picked up on the interviews, the videotape of Chris over there, and through his own self-admission, we have 2 factors at play here. He respects the police, he's humble, and he's compliant, and he's trying to assist with this investigation. And the police are going to push that as hard as they can. Any good, aggressive investigator is going to push that to figure out and find an anomaly in what he's saying. And I'm careful about what I say because I don't want to speak ill of the dead or anything like that, but by Chris's own admission on one of the videotapes, he admits to some drug use. Well, when you get involved in that, you're into tradecraft. It's an entirely different life because you're hiding that from somebody. Well, when you're hiding something from somebody, and we can argue all afternoon about what that means to have lack of candor or not be truthful. Everybody does it to a degree. Nobody walks into a car dealership and says, I want to pay this amount of money. It's always going to be some sort of holdback that takes place. But when you get in drugs, it's particularly acute. And he mentioned that portion of that. And now you're involved in tradecraft where you're having to hide something. So you really are used to having a portion of your life have some deception to it. So he engaged in that deception is my assessment of it. And when he did that, the police focus on this because the question that will be posed is, well, we know you're lying about that. What else are you lying about? So in the Reed technique, which is cited in the Judges for Justice document, that process, when he's engaging in this deception and they're pushing him, he gets involved. One of the interviewers is this former school resource officer who forms a bond with Chris, and Chris believes he can trust him. And that's what an investigation is all about. He's trying to get to the fact of it, and then Chris changes his story several times. Okay. Is it coercive? That's up for interpretation. It obviously wasn't coercive enough that it stopped the trial from going forward and going through the appeal process when it was looked at. There's 60 hours of interviews that happened on this. Could somebody argue it was coercive after that? Well, everybody says that. Every interview. And every interview is going to be a very hard and aggressive sort of questioning. Did they use deception in it? Yes, but that's been allowed. The Supreme Court has ruled on that deception is allowed. Now, certain states have afforded that. Can you fabricate evidence and present that? No, you can't. You can't do that. It's pushing it too far. That's generally been the rules on this. So, did they say they had admissions from Benjamin Hobbs already? I believe that's what they said. That would And did they say that you're going to get the electric chair or whatever the death penalty is in Idaho? They probably did that as well, as I read into the file over here. All of that creates a very intense atmosphere. And when you're used to telling stories or you're used to telling lies to get out of something, to maintain that persona, when you're into that, and I'm being very careful about what I say about somebody who's deceased, you're used to telling somebody something to get them off your back. And he got himself involved in that. And so at the end of the day, what happened is he made admissions. He made several admissions, and he changed his story. And he changed his story enough where it irritated the prosecutors to the point where they rescinded the immunity agreement that he engaged in. So he left himself very vulnerable all the way through. And what's astonishing to me is that he had an attorney along for the ride, but the attorney probably didn't know if he was being told the truth or not. I say it's astonishing to me because I don't know what he was telling the attorney or not. That's, of course, privileged information. Well, all of those things factor into this stew when they bring it to trial. The theory of the case was that he had something to do with it, and that the DNA, when it was cleared of him, was the co-conspirator, the co-offender in this case, which would have been Benjamin Hobbs. As we know later on, it didn't happen. But let me take a break from that because I know at some point, Carol Dodge, Angie's mom, is the advocate for Chris Tapp. Do you know why she started to believe him? Did that ever come over to you, or did you just get a phone call one day?
Well, when you're talking after he was already convicted and put into prison and had served something like 12 or 13 years, right?
Yeah. Is that when? That's when you first heard about it, huh?
Yeah. Well, no, it is actually even further than that because so my understanding of what happened was when Chris, when this whole thing went to trial, they basically had a somewhat of a confession from Chris, but on the other side, they also had a semen stain on Angie's sweatpants that she was wearing, and that's what she wore to bed. Well, they had the A profile, but it wasn't Chris's, and so based on that, and so he was convicted solely on his confession. And so they had no physical evidence against him, but he was still convicted. And so Carol knew that if the semen stain didn't match Chris Tapp, then that means that there's another guy out there. And she was determined to bring that man to justice as well. And so she started, the cops, once they had this conviction, and they had no new evidence, they had no more leads to follow up. It's like everything else and every other agency and every other investigator that's out there that I've ever talked to. You can't just keep staring at a file when nothing has changed. And you can't keep searching when you have no. It's like trying to cross the ocean without a compass. You're just going to wander around. So they had other things to do. They had other cases. They had other crimes they had to investigate. And so they did. And so they were kind of, they put Angie's case on the back burner until something new came around. Well, Angie's mom, Carol, she was still, as every mom would be, as every mama bear would be out there. She's like, I'm going to find this guy. So she started visiting Chris in prison. And, at first, when she was just visiting him, she was just like pounding on him saying, tell me who else was there. Tell me who else raped Angie. Tell me who else who was raping my daughter. And I want him to be sitting in the prison cell next to you. Yeah.
Now, at this point, Benjamin Hodge has been eliminated because of the DNA. So we're assuming maybe there's a third person. Is that what it is? Or they don't know because they haven't included him.
Well,
or you don't know it.
I'm not really sure about Benjamin Hodge. I think they cleared him pretty fast because he just didn't match. So there was this other person out there, and but Carol, she was just focused on, she said, the only guy that really knows is the guy that was there. I mean, she was assuming that Chris initially was guilty. And it was interesting of the times that I was actually talking to Carol. she said initially, in fact, when the guilty plea came down, she left the courtroom. She was, and there's video of her leaving, and she was so incensed that he would do this to her little baby girl that, she just couldn't be there anymore. And she said she hated this man like she had never hated anybody else. And so for her to actually drive down to that penitentiary and to visit him, I mean, she was a woman with a mission. I mean, that's just incredible to think of facing her daughter's killer face to face and actually asking him time and time again and visiting him over and over and over, just pleading with him to tell her who this other person was. Who was this other guy that actually raped her? Because the only DNA they had, the only semen stain they had was some male perpetrator that wasn't Chris Tapp. So over the years, and Chris Tapp, even when he was in prison, he maintained his innocence. In fact, his lawyer, the minute the guilty plea came down, Chris's lawyer looked at him and said, you need to appeal this. You are innocent. You need to appeal this. And you need to write to people, governors, other officials, and basically always maintain your innocence. Anyway, she knew that he was innocent, and he did too, but he was put in prison anyway. So Carol, as she was visiting him over the years, once they hit about 11, 12 years in prison, and having visited Chris Tapp so many times, getting to know him a little bit, always the fact that he would always maintain his innocence. And at some point, the thought came to her that maybe he didn't do this. Maybe he didn't kill Angie. And so then, when that realization fully hit her, things flipped, and she started not just, I'm sure it was a continuation of her research of evidence and everything else, but she actually started really getting into DNA and researching DNA, and she became, really knowledgeable about it. Well, fast forward another 4 or 5 years. So basically now Chris has got the Idaho Innocence Project, the interest from them. They're starting to really evaluate his case. They're starting to look at not only evidence, but also how the entire investigation went down. And that's when Carol was doing, again, research, and she found the MVAC online. She found some information about collecting DNA, and the MVAC came up. And so she called us, and one of my coworkers passed the call to me, which was kind of our tradition. Whenever a victim's family member calls, as the president of the company, I would always take the call. And so I remember that. I mean, this was years ago, and it's still brightly right there in my mind. I'm like, she called and she said, "This is Carol Dodge. My daughter was murdered," and kind of told me the story and said, "But there's this guy that's in prison. He's been convicted for my daughter's murder, but I don't think he did it." And
Wow.
that right there was one of the really amazing things, because how many times does somebody that is in prison actually do? One of their biggest advocates is the victim's parent. I mean, I'd never heard of that before. Have you?
No, I don't. I can't recall any case I have now.
Yeah. And so that kind of made it unique. But my biggest thing is when somebody calls us and it's a victim's family member or friend or anything else, I'm not the investigator. And I'm not an investigator. And so I try to be really careful about what I tell that other person, whether it be family member or friend or anything else. And it's the main reason is because I don't really have the background on it. I'm just getting one side of it. And so even if that side is 100% accurate, I still need to ascertain that. And so basically all I could do with Carol is just say, I'm so sorry for your loss. And I got an email address from her, and I sent her the typical information that I would send anybody or that I would give out at a conference. And so it's the basics of the MVAC, talks about really what it does, what its capabilities are, how it can collect more DNA than other traditional methods like swabbing, things like that. Maybe some case successes that it had had in the past. And so apparently when I sent that to Carol, she must have either forwarded it or printed it and taken it right to the police station, because the detective that was over Angie's case called me the next day and said, "Hey, I just got this information on the MVAC. Carol Dodge gave it to us, and I want to know more." And so now I'm talking to an investigator. So now I can go a lot more into detail. Find out what kind of evidence they had. That's and helping the detective understand what our system could do for him. A big part of that, in my opinion, is understanding what kind of evidence there are or there is, and kind of going from there. And that's kind of what I did with him. And most importantly, I forwarded him his information to another CSI in the Salt Lake area named Francine Bardol, who had an MVAC, and she was really good with it. She'd had it for a number of years, had worked multiple cases with it. And so she was kind of in the Salt Lake area. She's kind of the person that when you had any kind of an MVAC consultation where it had to be, law enforcement to law enforcement, I would always send things to her. And so she got involved with it. And next thing I know, they were bringing evidence down to, from Idaho down to Utah, and they were sampling it. And initially they had only focused on sampling, kind of where they thought Chris Tapp, if he was there and if he was holding Angie down while she was being raped, and, where would he be holding her? Where would he be depositing his DNA by gripping onto her ankle or her wrist or something like that? And so that's kind of what they were initially looking at. And they got DNA, but none of it matched Chris Tapp. That all matched that semen stain. And so then they're like, "Oh man, okay. So maybe that wasn't where." And so they basically said, "We want you to thoroughly MVAC every part of this of her clothing." And they knew that the perpetrator had used the teddy bear that Angie kept next to her bed, had used that and to muffle her screaming. And so Francine actually did such a thorough job that she took all the stuffing out of the teddy bear, and so that all the pieces could lay flat, and then the MVAC could be utilized, to its premium. And that she said that was an incredible amount of work. But yeah, so they literally just MVAC'd it more thoroughly than almost any other piece of evidence I've ever heard. And again, got tons of DNA, but it all matched the semen stain, and none of it matched Chris Tapp. And so basically they're looking at, this kid's been in prison 18, 19, going on 20 years now. And essentially, even with the most modern day tools, they should have some kind of physical evidence. I mean, his DNA, if you think about it, Tom, and all the crime scenes that you investigated and all the stories that you've read and things like that, if somebody was holding down a victim while another perpetrator, stabbed or raped or, anyway, assaulted a victim, their DNA would be all over. That person's DNA, you'd find it somewhere. And especially with a tool like the MVAC and how aggressive it is. And they couldn't find his DNA anywhere. So they now had no physical evidence. All they had was, his supposedly his confession, which he had rescinded. And so they let him out. They gave him that Alford plea.
This is it's painful to hear it all unravel that way. I draw a parallel from it. There's a case that's called Murders in Miramar. It took place around the same year. In fact, I think it may be the same year. It's on video right now, and it talks about a similar case of circumstances like this. But there's a strong movement to try and free this person, and I haven't gotten to the end of it. But I do recall this one happening, and the same allegations are passed. But it was three people were killed inside of a house, home invasion type thing, presumably to get either money or drugs that were in the house. But I draw that same parallel. It brings me back. So if our viewers are interested in watching that same time period, things were different, of course, in 96. I tell a story about you had to document each long-distance phone call. You didn't have newspapers coming to you every day giving you intelligence about what was happening in the area, and you had to make phone calls, and all based on relationships. So I'll also say, too, we were coming out of an era when the detective was sacrosanct. That detective was left alone to develop themselves, and they had implemented something new called the flow, where they were taking detectives and rotating them in and rotating them out. So you lost that continuity in your detectives, the detective bureaus, by having that diverse and very polymathic type investigators who went back to the road. Well, that was a mistake, because those prior to that, the detectives were very, very good at this, and they understood those cases. Can't tell you why they invoked that. Was it a ploy to weaken the detective's strength, or was it a way to make things better? I don't know. But anyway, that is what happened at those time periods. So that became a very trendy thing to do. I bring that up because that detective has to keep all of those facts in his or her head as they're getting into this, because when you are talking about details that only the perpetrator could have known, those are sacred tidbits of information, and that's what they seem to rely on in this case, that were coupled with what Chris confessed to. And so this is what essentially did him in. I hate to use that term, but this is what got him convicted, was that standing on your head and saying that he had details. Well, when somebody has those details that are withheld, it's crossing the line. That's pretty much prima facie that the person did that. The problem with this is you had 7 detectives, or at least they were named on that. You had multiple people, and somehow those details were passed over to Chris, and they may not have known each was doing that. There may have been other people interviewing him. How is that different now in salesmanship when you have the turnover to a salesman who can better bond with the potential customer? You just have similar personalities. It's not too different. So those things do happen. I don't have a good answer for that, but I suspect that's probably because I don't think anybody set out to go and say, hey, let's ruin Chris Tapp's life. I think everybody would agree that that's what they were trying to do. They're trying to clear this homicide and move it along. So those are how those mistakes happened, and how those things, I guess there's 60 hours of recorded interviews, and we all know what that meant in 96. That meant when you turn on the tape machine versus, and maybe I'm speaking out of turn here, they could have had that mandated process where you had to interview inside of an interview area, and you always had to have that videotape running. That was trendy about that time. But I'm saying that there could have been informal conversations in addition to the 60 hours. So there's give and take, and there's information that is given to them. So the person writing that probable cause affidavit, or whatever the equivalent is, that brings either to an indictment or that charging document, is the holder of all those facts, and those sacrosanct facts that are passed to the prosecution and that are presented to the jury as only the offender could have known. That's what holds that weight for the trial, and that's what was coupled with his own confession that was here, and why he made all those admissions. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's here's the antithesis of that, Jared, when I make mention of this. So then what are you going to do with the police? I've been in interviews with that. I've been the co-interviewer where I've shown up and somebody asks something to the effect of like this. Did you rob that bank? No. You sure? No, I did not rob that bank. Okay. All right. Thanks for your time. I mean, is that what we want to do? Because that's what you're asking. So I say that as devil's advocate. You want to have investigators that are savvy, but they have to protect those facts. And we do not have a intelligence process in the United States where we have hyperlinks and we have keywords that are set aside. Attorneys have that. They have high-speed indexing, and they have things built in that they can find keyword searches and stuff like that. But when they start providing those resources, to detectives, we're going to start seeing those perfect investigations that take place. But let's face it, in America, you have the right to the rich get richer and the poor get prison, as it said. But when you see those big defenses come forth and they're very, very good researchers aboard and private investigators, that needs to happen as well in the police departments. And that's not fair to take shots at these PDs, these guys that are doing the best they can, and they're not getting training all that time on these most recent things that happen. They're doing it on an ad hoc basis, and they're inventing it as they are. So when you put that in context, it makes sense how these things happen. But unfortunately, the linchpin on this was Chris made those admissions, and they used those against him. And he crossed the immunity document, the agreement rather. Once he did that, he was really in a bad way. And so yes, 20 years was. Of course, the key thing is they thought he'd done it the entire time. And
Yeah.
as Carol looked at it,
in all the time that I've looked at this and been involved in it, I've never doubted that the investigators weren't maliciously trying to frame this guy. And I think they were just pushing super hard. They had what they considered a hot lead, and they had a suspect that could have done it. They obviously worked to eliminate this Chris Tapp and like Ben Hobbs, but he kept being there as a possibility. And so how it came about, I'm like you, Tom. I don't want to ever say anything negative about law enforcement that if they don't 100% deserve it. I mean, how he was interrogated, yeah, that's been picked apart endlessly, and they back then. But again, we look at it from 2023 standards. Back in 1996, well, like you said, things were just done differently back there. You didn't have the physical evidence capabilities that you have now. You don't have cell phone pinging. You don't have, in fact, I don't even know. I mean, what did we have in 96? Like flip phones? I mean,
yeah, right.
If we could have actually text messages, I think we would have been excited about that. If you look behind me on my shelf over there, I've got one of the very first mobile phones that my dad had. I mean, the thing is a huge clunky Motorola that, but even when that came out in the 80s, we thought that was the coolest thing in the world. And so, technology, you can't look at a case like this based on today's context, because it's just not fair to do. There's so many tools that we have nowadays to narrow down suspects and to get information, from them and about them that it just wasn't available back in the 90s, let alone the 80s or the 70s. And so, I guess that's just a long way of saying, yeah, did the investigation go sideways and did they get the wrong guy? Yes, they did. But could that have been avoided? Not based on what I've seen. I mean, they were doing the best that they thought they could, as most investigators do. So, yeah.
Yeah, I heard some of the tapes, and they were asking him, pushing him for details, and they're asking him very poignant questions about the actual sex act itself to see, if he had knowledge of it, or how's he going to say, I don't know. And then inexplicably, he goes along with this. So it's very hard to, and I'm not an apologist for the investigation that took place, because I'm not, and the facts are what the facts are and they work out. But you're working with this whole cacophony of investigative tools that you have very little at the time. And so let's bring that all the way forward. How do things work now? Well, what are we going to do? Walk in and say, you have the right to an attorney. I can't ask you any questions. Is that what we want? Okay, so let's go that route. We'll sit back and say we're only going to file things unless we have DNA evidence, because that's the gold standard. Hey, that's great until you get people in Tyvek suits and with gauntlet gloves running around doing the crime. That won't take very long at all for that to happen. And they're going to turn off their cell phones or leave them behind. And then they're just going to say, hey, these are the prosecutive guidelines. So what is it that the apologists want? And I say that because I want to, what we're doing is unique to these. I think 2020, there's been a couple of documentaries on this. And they take this bent that the police dropped the ball, they were inept or something like that. That's dishonest and unfair, or at a minimum, you're ill-informed of police procedurals of the day, meaning you should know what was available to them back then. And then you want to speak to it and say that, you want to know what their caseload is and things like that, then that's fine. I think that's an honest appraisal of what happened over here. And I think that's where we're going on this thing. And that's how this whole travesty and tragedy happened on Chris Tapp. He passed away a month ago, and I read that it was a head injury, and the best we can discern from it was that he had a freak accident. He tripped and fell, had a head injury in Las Vegas, and bled out from that. I know of Bob Saget and William Holden died in a similar fashion from that. Exsanguination was William Holden. He bled out from that, and I think Bob Saget was very similar to it. In his case, they said brain bleed, and they left the information on that. So I'll leave that open to interpretation. But I think a tragic end to a guy who like 3 years of freedom. Is that what he ultimately got? Maybe 6. Am I right on 2017?
Yeah, boy, it wasn't very long. So trying to think, I think it was like 2018 when he was actually set free. So that's at most 5 years. So, and then, when he was freed, he was initially not exonerated. He only got out on that Alford plea. And then once they actually found the real perpetrator, Drips, and they went through that whole process. And so then Chris was actually exonerated. And I remember that, by the way. I went up to Idaho for his actual exoneration hearing. And that was amazing. It was really cool. So when the judge was able to say, Mr. Tapp, you are free to go. And, he was able to just say how excited he was. And this is one of the things that I really want to throw out there, Tom, because there are so many stories of people that they get wronged in some way, and they're bitter for some of them the rest of their lives. And they just can't get over being slighted or being wronged in whatever way they were. And honestly, I can't imagine very many people being wronged to the point that they serve in prison. They lose 20 years of their lives. And this is, you think about what you were doing from the age of basically 17 to about 39, that 20-year period right in there, that's some of the best years of most people's lives. That's when you are going to college, or critical work years. Usually you're developing relationships, you're getting married, you're having your first kids, you're developing your career. And, by the time you're 40, most of that has already happened, and you're well into your own, your life is well established. Well, Chris Tapp was sitting in prison all of those major years. And yet, and this is the critical point that I want to make. Chris, when I met him, and you can go back again to that episode. It's one of the very first episodes that I ever did, because he was so impactful to me. When I first met him, I remember the Idaho Innocence Project. I was in touch with him, and I heard that Chris was going to be over in Boise and meeting with the Idaho Innocence Project and all the people that had helped him get exonerated. So I loaded up an MVAC and I drove up to Boise, and because I wanted to show him the machine that helped him get out of prison. And, everybody up there at the Idaho Innocence Project wanted to see it as well. And so, but, I got to spend a little bit of time with Chris, and I couldn't believe, and to this day, it's just the most amazing thing I've ever seen. He was so, man, how do you even describe it? I mean, he wasn't bitter the way I would have expected him to be. Most people, if you don't pay him back $100, that you've borrowed a year ago, they just lose it. But this guy was robbed of 20 years of the best years of his life. And yet he was just grateful. He was just happy that he was free. He was just excited that he could go get a job and could drive around freely. And he was just excited that he could, go find a girl that he could take to dinner. It was just the most amazing thing I'd ever seen. The fact that he wasn't going to let the past 20 years and how he'd been wronged, he wasn't going to let that ruin his life. And that was his attitude when I met him. And, when I interviewed him for the show, that was still his attitude. Now, I'd lost track with him. I haven't seen him for, the past 4 or 5 years. And so how he interacted, especially because I know they sued I'm not sure if it was Bannock County or the state of Idaho.
It was Idaho Falls.
What's
that? It was the PD. It was the PD itself.
Oh, okay. Well,
or the city of, yeah.
Yeah. And he ended up getting, a fairly sizable not reward, but settlement from that, which is justifiable. And so, how his life developed from there, I know he got married because he was in the middle of a divorce when he passed away, but how he, did he stay, grateful and just trying to pursue a new life? Or did his attitude change? That part I don't know, but all I know is that when I first met him again, he was just grateful to be free, and that right there blew me away to the point that it still is just an absolute marvel.
Yeah, I in the lead up to this episode, I did a bunch of research, and after 30 years of doing this, both as a police detective and a special agent, I've seen one or two things and sat in on one or two interviews and been on trainings, and I tried to consider myself a lifetime student and learner, always looking for better ways to interview and also just to be a better investigator. So a certain amount of cynicism sets in, and I sat there and listened to him unravel his whole tale, both in the public TV shows and then on another podcast, and of course speaking with you as well. So I was looking for anomalies. I was looking for aberrations that are going to tell me that he's not telling the truth or there's some inconsistency. And I hear quite often that just because he's found not guilty doesn't mean he wasn't guilty. It doesn't mean he's innocent. And in this case, he was. We know that Brian Dripps admitted to being the sole perpetrator on this. And then, of course, this extensive amount of touch DNA work that was done by Francine and with the MBAC and things like that serves to solidify that almost beyond any conceivable doubt, not reasonable doubt. So we know that to be the case. But what I was looking for was, okay, so he came under scrutiny somehow, and, he was honest enough to admit his past history and what he got involved in. He spoke about his marriage. It spawned from prison, and he said he wasn't there to be a dad or to be a husband, and those things caused him stress, and so they were going through hard times when, and ironically, or however we want to state it, that his wife was killed just months before he himself died. And he spoke to that with such clarity and such conviction. So, really kind of I can see how he talked himself into these circumstances by saying that the right way and being fair to a deceased person by saying it that way. But he believed in that system and he allowed himself to get that way versus somebody who's going to be antagonistic. But do we want people, and are we there now? And this is one of those rhetorical questions. Do we want everybody to just ask for an attorney and turn on their phone and record the police now? Are we at that point? Because maybe that's where we want to go. And unfortunately, if Chris had done that, that probably wouldn't have happened. But we didn't have that ability back in 1996 and where that happened. But yes, I would agree with you emphatically that he was extremely humble and he didn't hold that grudge. And I looked for that. I looked for that sort of softening of his persona so he would be in a courtroom and he could present himself as a sympathetic character so he could get a bigger settlement. And I just didn't see it, and it'd be nice for my cynical self to have seen that and gone, I know what he's up to. I just didn't see that, and that's really speaks humanity. How's the phrase done, Jared? hope in humanity reinstilled or something like that.
Yeah. Get a little more faith
Yeah,
in
so
humanity and yeah.
faith in humanity restalled.
Well,
Restalled.
yeah. I
Yeah.
Again, I look at the man, and other than up through his childhood and his teenage years, which I don't know a lot of history about, how he grew up. I know he wasn't, well off when he was growing up, and so, exactly what kind of a childhood he had, yeah, I'm not really sure, and I'm not sure it's worth really looking into. But the bottom line is, this poor guy, by the time he was 19 years old, was in a you know a full a penitentiary. He was in prison by the time he's 19, and he gets out at 39, and sadly, by the time he's 44, 45, he's passed away. And so, how many years did he really have of freedom? And with any kind of resources, it was probably just a minimal, one or two, probably by the time he got his settlement and was actually enjoying any semblance of true freedom. Hopefully you had some experiences in there, but again, I don't know all of that, and so. And I don't want to solely focus on, the tragedy of his life, but I think if any of us could learn anything about life in general from and some life lessons from what Chris Tapp went through, and even what the Dodge family went through, is number one, never give up. If you know the truth, then never give up on it. And neither Chris gave up on it, and Carol Dodge didn't give up on it. And kudos to both of them. And to me, also a huge life lesson is, even as well, I cannot fathom anything happening in my life that could even remotely resemble how bad Chris Tapp had it. And if he can come out of this with a just a grateful and a non-bitter type of attitude, then I certainly can. And I really have no right to complain about most anything, compared when I compare my story with his. And so hopefully that's where a lot of people are.
Yeah, there's a lot of good lessons that come out of this, and kudos out to Idaho Falls for walking this thing back and making it right afterwards, not bunkering in, and looking at it with open eyes, and bringing it to fruition, and everybody walking that back. Kudos to Carol Dodge for doing the right thing on this, and making things right, making that phone call to you. Yeah, that was great. That's great, and she was a seeker of truth on this, and that's what ultimately led to this. I hate to say it, but Brian Drips got this nightmare to go away from him once he confessed to this and got it off his chest. So I don't want to say kudos, but the lesson is that this guy was waiting for this day, and the nightmare's over for him. Could he have come forward all this time? Of course he could have. Of course he could have. But that's a tall order for somebody who is not, not walking with the rest of us in society. Just leave it at that. A lot of good things on this. And of course, the Innocence Project, Justices, Judges for Justice, an NGO that looked into this, and a couple other ones. I think the Idaho as well as New York had joined forces on this thing to sort of look at these things. And, technology changes, and that's ultimately what got Drips. I think it was a genetic genealogy, maybe workup that was done. I don't think it was CODIS, was it? Yeah.
They eventually got him with the genetic genealogy, and
that's right. He had a stepfather, so he was outside of that. That's correct. Yeah, that's what thwarted
that story
it.
Was kind of had some interesting twists as well. But I think one person that we just have to absolutely include in there is Francine Bardol. I mean, the effort that she put in.
Good two of that. Yeah.
Yeah. 2 thumbs up.
Yeah, tell that story, would you? Did you explain the stuffing previously?
Yeah. I mean, we kind of went over that, but the thing about Francine, and I know there's a lot of investigators out there, not just CSIs, but DNA analysts or evidence analysts. There are analysts out there that, and CSIs like Francine, that will go so far above and beyond what their job description is in order to bring justice for victims. And it is marvelous to see. And like you said, Tom, it puts faith back into the justice system for me, because I've seen Francine work, and I've sat down with her in her office and actually talked about some MVAC cases and things like that when she was still with the West Jordan PD. And it's amazing. I mean, she will sit down and and spend a ton of time on the phone or in person with the detectives and the people that are actually, beating the streets, and they will go through every single piece of evidence with a fine-tooth comb. And it's awesome to see, because I'll tell you what, the amount of effort that they put into trying to solve that case and seeking for the truth is absolutely awesome. And she's, even to this day, is still, working with her own business, and does a ton of MVAC work because she knows what an amazing tool it is. And it's just awesome to watch. And if you haven't, if there's any investigators out there and you want to know, especially CSIs, if you really want, she should be offering classes, and because how she goes about it and how thorough she is and how she tries to examine every piece of evidence from every angle is it's amazing. And so, yeah,
Hey,
Francine's a hero in this as well.
as long as we're pushing the name out there, she was involved in the Maiden Water. She resolved that one, correct? Maiden Water murder. I'm going to say Forensic Files season 2.
5.
Am I correct
Actually,
on that one?
Mainwater
5.
is, yeah.
Okay, that was
Season
her.
5, yeah. And
That was an
yeah,
MVAC
yeah,
case,
she
right?
did.
Yeah,
She
so
helped
good.
with the MVAC work on the Mainwater case too. So
Yeah. And, and for true crime fans that are out there, I'm going to use like this battery right here and simulate. So when somebody says this guy was holding and saying this battery is a cup or a bottle, he attacked me with a bottle. And, there's a big difference between fingerprints being in situ like this and being fingerprints being used as if this was a bottle. Big difference. All of that evidence should comport with what the person's saying, even that finger placement of all those digits right there. And those are the things, the details that really takes a good investigator, and have that good marriage between the investigator and the crime scene tech, unless that detective is also a crime scene tech. And that's why I have that passion for this forensics, because when you show that to a jury and you show that there should be no chinks in that armor at all. That entire process should lay out very well for you. And sometimes you just don't have the evidence, but when you do, or those little things there, it should be sacrosanct. It should be, 100%. So I say that because Francine did that, like you said that earlier. I'm sorry, I was actually researching a bit on the history when you went through that previously on the case, on a specific detail on there. But that's an amazing piece of work, and I don't throw that hyperbole out there lightly. But when she laid out every bit of stuffing or of that teddy bear looking for DNA, you have somebody who can come back and say it has been thoroughly searched head to toe, soup to nuts, and there is no DNA in there. So yes.
yeah.
Big
Yeah,
thumbs up to
pretty
those crime
awesome.
scene investigators who do entire garments, with the MVAC, and it takes multiple filters, as we know, or they're not letting any stones be unturned to solve those cases and leave no doubt in anybody's mind. And that's the way it should be. That's the way it should be.
Yeah.
I Before we close, I suppose I had a case many years ago as detective, and it was a guy with a bald head, which was kind of uncommon for a young guy, but he was, I'm going to say skinhead perhaps or whatever. Anyway, very rather unique, and he really beat up a security guard. He actually stole some OC spray and then shoplifted some other items. And then when he was confronted by the security guard, the undercover security guard at Walmart, he sprayed him in the face and then proceeded to beat him up really, really well. And the security guard was able to write the number down on the tag. Well, in those days, you couldn't get real-time photographs. You had to order off photographs of the driver's licenses from Tallahassee, and they would send them to you, hard copy via surface mail. So there was about a 3-day turnaround on that, and then you would see who that person was. Well, in that 3 days, another person came in. I had the victim call up and said, the guy's in the store right now. So we respond out there, guns in the face and everything else and take this guy into custody as much as we detain him. And he has no idea. Well, his deportment is such that this has got the wrong guy. Well, maybe he's an accomplished liar. So I'm sitting there and I'm like, gosh, man, this is a matching rape. And I'm putting myself in that same time period and saying, would that have happened? And I'm saying it's got to be the guy. This is eyewitness testimony. No, that victim had projected onto this bald-headed guy that this was the person. So eyewitness testimony is fallible. I learned a valuable lesson from that I need to be sure, and we all need to be sure, that we have some kind of evidence that backs that up. And it doesn't have to be a fingerprint on there. It has to be a timeline or some kind of sacrosanct piece of information that's going to lock that person in on that, that's going to allow that to happen. And that is a very tough job to account for everybody's 100%, all property, all evidence, all what they touch, and that timeline. So, but I learned a valuable lesson from that I wasn't going to grab this guy and arrest him. Of course, the probable cause fell apart at that point, and then the next day the photograph shows up on our subject or suspect, and it wasn't the guy, but I put them both together. I ordered them up to use that as an example. So this is the things that happen, and I think Hitchcock made a lot of his movies about that. The Wrong Man, the series of circumstances that throw somebody in here. Boy, if this isn't one of those cases of it that got extrapolated over 20 years and 52 days.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Tom. Well, in closing, I just like to say rest in peace, Chris Tapp, and hopefully your legacy will live on in a way that will help future investigations, and it can always be some kind of a case that people can study and see what went wrong, what went right, and learn from it and be better. But most importantly, you're in a better place now, and I hope, Chris, you find eternal rest. So, all right, Tom, appreciate it, buddy. And
all right, Jared.
Yeah, we'll talk again soon.
See you on the next one.
Thanks for joining us. Your attention today brings us one step closer to exposing and eliminating the evil that brings crime to our communities. Hit subscribe and share this episode. Together, we will bring justice to every victim.